So for this week's classic interview, I want to go back to an interview that's now almost 5 years old. It's from 2014 with Bill Blunden, who's a cybersecurity and surveillance expert. Because of the recent change to Julian Assange's status, not having asylum anymore from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, with discussions of WikiLeaks, cyber hacking, Russia, the Trump campaign, 2016. Bill Blunden, when I interviewed him back in 2014, had extraordinary insights into a lot of these issues in sort of more general or overarching ways that I think are very, very interesting to go back to. So let's do that now. My interview with Bill Blunden from May of 2014. Take a look. Bill Blunden joins me today. He's an independent computer security researcher, also author of the book Behold a Pale Farce, Cyberwar, Threat Inflation, and the Malware Industrial Complex. Bill, it's great to talk to you, and thanks for being here. This is just generally an area where legitimate fears and hyperbole seem to mix, and sometimes it's hard to tell what's what. So let's start with maybe the broadest question. When it comes to cyber warfare and malware, what really are the most pressing risks that the average everyday American should be aware of?
Well, I definitely think that there is an awful lot of cybercrime. I mean, if you look at the Target breach recently, I believe it cost Target something like $200 million to recover from that. And there's also espionage, obviously. Some of it we're involved in. And there's sabotage, too. If you look at Stuxnet, we sabotaged their uranium enrichment facility. So I would say there's lots of cybercrime, there's espionage, there's sabotage. And while they aren't existential problems, I think they're serious problems and they need to be addressed. And I think on a day-to-day basis, those are the real threats that the average person is going to face.
So let's talk about some of the doomsday scenarios that maybe people have heard about. In fact, some that some guests on our program have talked about in more detail. So these would be a total takedown of the electrical grid for the country or parts of the country, attacking the banking system in a way that would make everyday transactions impossible, financial markets, and significantly affecting the everyday financial transactions that we're involved in. How real are those threats, in your opinion?
I think from the standpoint of statistical analysis, there is no data on any of this. There are plenty of metaphors they use. They use terms like Cyber 911, Cyber Katrina, Cyberwar. They use terms like Cyber Armageddon or Cybergeddon shortened. And like I said, there's no data on this, so it's hard to really make a solid prediction, at least from a quantitative standpoint. But the people who are promoting these ideas, they tend to focus on how bad it'll be when it happens. And I think this is their tell that this is not intended, this message isn't intended to appeal to reason. It's there to appeal to emotion. It's there to incite an emotional response. It's there to elicit anxiety and to kind of foment a crisis mentality. This is what's called threat inflation. It's a propaganda technique that's being used. And we saw it before in the Iraq War when President Bush and other White House officials talked about the smoking gun that came in the form of a mushroom cloud. And when you get someone who's in an anxious position, who's kind of in a crisis mentality, they'll pay any amount of money to be safe. But if you think about it, a rational person, even though there are several types of insurance you could buy, there's countless types of insurance, but you don't go out and buy every type of insurance. You carefully compute what your risk is to each threat, and then you make a cost-benefit analysis, and you decide carefully how you're going to protect yourself. And when you're in this crisis mentality, when you're anxious, and you've been kind of subjected to threat inflation, you're in a position where you can waste a lot of resources and yield up your civil liberties and try to protect yourself at a very high cost, and in doing so neglect these genuine threats that we face on a day-to-day basis. I think that the actual threat of Cyber Armageddon is actually pretty low. And a lot of officials agree with this. The people who run the grid organizations, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the chief executive of that organization says, we're not worried about the cyber threat. We're far more worried about the physical threats. And that would make sense because there actually are a lot of instances where there have been physical instances that brought down power. And the same thing with the banking industry. I think that people don't give the banking industry enough credit. Large financial institutions like the Federal Reserve, they have all sorts of elaborate disaster recovery measures in place, and they go to lengths, to great lengths. They have professionals who are dedicated to keeping these networks safe. And to think that you're going to disable our financial institutions, they keep backups, and they keep them in vaults underground. I think to stop an institution like the Federal Reserve, to really grind it to a halt over a long term, you'd probably need a nuclear first strike.
So you mentioned something interesting there, which was the amount that you're willing to give up in terms of privacy or civil liberties seems to be directly correlated to how afraid or anxious you are about a particular scenario. And we've talked about this quite a bit recently in light of the revelations from Edward Snowden, which, if you had paid attention to the passing of the Patriot Act, and if you saw the level of fear and thus what Americans were willing to accept in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, you wouldn't really have been that surprised by the revelations of Edward Snowden, which kind of gets us to another area I wanted to ask you about. We often hear the response to news that there is surveillance being done of Americans of, listen, I'm confident I'm not doing anything wrong, and therefore, I just don't really care. Go ahead and spy on me. I don't really care. It makes no difference to me. In general, my responses to that is, well, listen, we have a certain level of overcriminalization in this country. And even if you truly believe you're not really doing anything wrong, having this information in the hands of different government agencies may at some point in the future, who even knows what laws you may be breaking or may have retroactively broken at some point. And that makes me very cautious. But I'm wondering, are there better arguments against those who say, hey, I'm doing nothing wrong, I don't care?
I think that we need to understand very clearly that these civil liberties are safeguards against oppression, against despots. And the people who founded them believed enough to die for them. And anyone who's grown up, my wife grew up in Beijing during the Cultural Revolution. She knows what it's like to live in a police state. Anyone who lived in Russia during the reign of Stalin understands why you need these liberties, why they're important, because you don't know how much you miss them until they're taken away. And I think to an extent, we're starting to see signs of the same illness here in the United States. For example, the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act has detainment provisions, which are very unsettling for journalists and activists who could be deemed cooperating with terrorists somehow and be detained without any sort of due process. I think that this whole right now we exist in a surveillance state. I have no doubt in my own mind that we have the corporate players and the government spies have put in place a mechanism where they can monitor almost everything at real time, and to assume that our secret policies, which are judged by courts that are secret, and issue mandates that are secret, to believe that this secret mechanism will safeguard us from devolving into a police state, I think is really the height of recklessness. I think it's a huge threat to our democratic republic.
See, it's interesting because I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Bill. And the issue I have, and I ask this not in a rhetorical sense, but this is really an internal discussion that we have all the time on the program, which is, on the one hand, I generally tend to agree with the ideas you're espousing when it comes to surveillance, although maybe in a little bit less of a, apocalyptic sense. But at the same time, there's a crossover between the beliefs you've just espoused with regard to surveillance and the extreme pro-gun, Second Amendment, gun-toting enthusiasts that are supporting all sorts of laws that I think are quite destructive in different states around the country. Do you see the two sides as one battle, so to speak, or do you see how the two may be different?
I think that if you wanted to really draw a distinction between the civil libertarians and the libertarians, it has to do with ultimately the role of government. Obviously, libertarians, they believe they can exist without government. And my response to that is, if you want to see what it's like to live in a society without any government, go hang out in the tribal regions of Pakistan for a little while. The civil libertarians, they believe that government's actually, it should be there as a safeguard against things like people dumping toxic waste, for example, or the banks who are running rampant right now. So, ostensibly, the government's there to safeguard us. Obviously, it's not doing a very good job of that. But I think in terms of civil libertarians and libertarians, you have basically right-left kind of. It has to do, the difference between the two has to do with role of government. But I think there is some common ground in terms of the idea of, are we going to trade liberty for security? And there was an op-ed piece that was written by Tom Friedman in the New York Times several months back. It was called Blowing a Whistle. And he basically said his argument was that we should give up a little bit of our liberty, just give up a little, just so that we can prevent an attack which will end up taking away all of our freedoms. So that this attack will be so great, this terrorist attack will be so apocalyptic that it will end all of our other freedoms and we'll end up, in a really bad situation. So he said, I'd be willing to give up a little liberty up front to safeguard ourselves against such an attack. And I think there was enough negative response that Bill Keller actually wrote a second op-ed shortly afterwards, reinforcing and trying to bolster Tom Friedman's position. But ultimately, they're both saying that we should undermine the Constitution to save it. And it reminds me of Iraq, where we said we have to destroy Iraq in order to save it. And I think that even our founding fathers disagreed with this. Benjamin Franklin, for example, said those who would yield essential liberty on behalf of a little temporary security deserve neither liberty or security. And I agree. I think in this case, it's not terrorism that destroys freedom. It's our response to terrorism that destroys freedom. The British government, back during World War II, when they were being bombed by the Germans, they would hang these signs out that said, remain calm, carry on.
Right.
And I think that's what we need to do. I think if you look at how Japan handled the nerve gas attacks by the Aum Shinrikyo, did they rely on indefinite detention? Did they torture people? Did they use mass interception? Did they suspend civil liberties? They didn't do any of that. No, they had their police conduct investigations. They indicted people and they tried them in a civilian court. Very simple, very straightforward. They remained calm and they carried on. And I think that's what we need to do as a country.
Very interesting. The distinction between civil libertarians and libertarians, definitely something we're going to explore further. The book is Behold, a Pale Farce. Bill Blunden, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David.